Introduction. Close your eyes for a moment. Actually, do not close them, you are reading this. But imagine something with me. Imagine you are standing in a room full of people. Everyone around you is speaking English, laughing, joking, telling stories, switching effortlessly between ideas and emotions and punchlines. And you understand most of it. You actually do. Your brain is processing the words. You recognize the vocabulary. You know the grammar. And yet your mouth stays shut. Your heart is racing. Your palms are damp. A sentence starts to form somewhere deep inside you. It rises up toward your throat, and then it just stops, like a car that stalls before it reaches the road. You smile and nod instead. You let someone else answer. You wait for the moment to pass. And afterward, alone, you replay the whole thing in your head, in English, perfectly. Every word comes easily. Every sentence flows. You are brilliant in the privacy of your own mind. The conversation you should have had plays out like a movie, and in this movie you are articulate, confident, even funny. Why? Why is it so easy when no one is watching, and so impossible the moment someone is? That question is the reason this book exists. For years, language teachers and linguists and self-help writers have tried to answer this by giving you more. More vocabulary lists, more grammar drills, more textbooks. More apps that reward you with little coins and fire streaks. And to their credit, some of that works in the sense that you do learn things. But it does not solve the real problem, because the real problem was never a shortage of English. The real problem is your brain. Not your brain in the way people usually mean when they say that. They usually mean you are not smart enough, or you did not study hard enough, or you do not have natural talent. That is not what I mean at all. What I mean is something entirely different, something that neuroscience and psychology have been quietly mapping for decades, while most language teachers never got the memo. Your brain has built a wall. It is not a wall of ignorance. It is a wall of protection. Your brain, doing exactly what it was designed to do, has decided that speaking English in front of real people carries a risk. Not a physical risk. Of course, no tiger is going to attack you if you say the wrong tense. But your brain does not always know the difference between social risk and survival risk. Embarrassment, rejection, judgment, your nervous system processes these things through some of the same ancient circuits that were once responsible for keeping you alive. When your brain detects potential threat, it does not pause to ask whether the threat is a predator or a grammar mistake. It just fires. And that firing is what you feel as silence, as frozen tongue, as the dreaded blank mind in the middle of a sentence. Here is what changes everything. Once you understand that your brain is not failing you, but protecting you, you stop fighting yourself. And the moment you stop fighting yourself, the wall starts to come down. This book is about how to take that wall apart brick by brick, layer by layer, using real science and real techniques that actually work in real conversations, not in classrooms, not on apps, not in the imaginary perfect world where you have 3 seconds to think before every sentence. We are going to go deep. We are going to talk about how your brain acquires language versus how it performs language, and why those are two completely different processes that almost no one distinguishes. We are going to talk about the fear that lives in your nervous system and how to work with it rather than against it. We are going to talk about the internal voice, the one that judges everything you say before it leaves your mouth, and how to quiet it. We are going to talk about identity, because one of the most underestimated reasons people stay stuck in a second language is that they do not yet believe, at the bone-deep level, that they are someone who speaks English. We are also going to talk about specific, practical things you can do starting today, not tomorrow, not after you finish a course or reach some imaginary threshold of readiness. Today. But before we get there, I want to say something directly to you, something I mean completely and want you to really hear. You are not bad at English. Read that again. You are not bad at English. The fact that you are here, reading or listening to this, means you already have a level of English comprehension that hundreds of millions of people in the world do not have. You have studied. You have practiced. You have spent hours and years building a language inside your mind. The English is there. I promise you it is there. The problem, the only problem, is that your brain has not yet learned to let it out safely. That is what we are going to fix. 10 chapters. Each one targeting a different layer of the block. Each one armed with science, with stories, with strategies, and with a kind of truth that most language programs are too polite or too commercial to tell you. By the time you finish this book, you will not just understand why you have been stuck, you will have the tools to get unstuck. And more importantly, you will have started to change the way your brain thinks about English not as a test you might fail, but as a tool that belongs to you. Let us begin. Chapter 1. The Acquisition Trap. Why you know English but cannot speak it. There is a distinction that will change the way you understand yourself as a language learner, and it comes from one of the most important researchers in the history of linguistics, a man named Stephen Krashen. In the 1970s and 80s, Krashen proposed something that initially struck many of his colleagues as too simple to be true. He said there is a fundamental difference between acquiring a language and learning a language, and these two processes, he argued, are not just different in degree, they are different in kind. Learning is what happens in classrooms. It is conscious. It is deliberate. You study a rule, let us say, the third-person singular present tense, the rule that makes you add an S to verbs when the subject is he, she, or it, and you memorize it. You practice it. You can explain it. When someone asks you to describe the rule, you can describe it. This is learning. It lives in your explicit memory, the same part of your brain that stores facts and procedures you can deliberately recall. Acquisition is completely different. Acquisition is what happened when you learned your first language as a child. No one sat you down and explained noun-verb agreement. No one gave you a worksheet about question formation. You simply heard language, enormous quantities of it, in context, with meaning attached, with emotion attached, with real human interaction surrounding it, and your brain, without any conscious instruction, built the grammar from the inside. You acquired it. It lives somewhere different in your mind, in a kind of deep, intuitive grammar that you access automatically, without thought, without effort. Here is the problem for most people who have studied English in a formal setting. They have learned a great deal, but they have not acquired enough. They have filled their explicit memory with rules. They can conjugate verbs on a test. They can identify a passive construction in a sentence. They can explain what the present perfect means in theory. But when they try to have a real conversation, none of that explicit knowledge is fast enough. Real speech happens in real time. A native speaker produces about 150 words per minute. There is simply no time, in the middle of an actual conversation, to consciously access a grammar rule, apply it, check it, and then produce the sentence. By the time you've done all that, the conversation has moved on without you. What fluent speakers are doing is not retrieving rules. They are accessing patterns. Deep, ingrained, automatic patterns that were laid down through enormous exposure. When a native English speaker says, "I've been waiting for you," they're not thinking past perfect progressive formed with have plus been plus the present participle used to describe an action that began in the past and continues to the present. They just say it because it sounds right. That feeling of rightness, that intuitive sense, is acquired grammar doing its job. Now, here is what this means for you personally. If you studied English in a school, if your English education consisted primarily of grammar explanations, vocabulary lists, translation exercises, and tests, then you have probably developed very strong learned knowledge with relatively weaker acquired knowledge. You know the rules, but you have not yet built the automatic patterns. And so when you try to speak, there is a mismatch between what your brain knows and what it can do in real time. You know the house is full of furniture, but you cannot get from room to room quickly enough to have a real conversation. This is not a character flaw. This is not laziness or low intelligence. This is what happens when a brain is given the wrong kind of input at the wrong time in the wrong way. The school system taught you about English. What your brain actually needs to build fluency is massive exposure to English in use, not in explanation, but in action, in context, in meaning, carrying communication. Krashen called this comprehensible input. The idea is deceptively simple. You acquire language when you understand messages in that language, not when you memorize rules about it. When you read something and understand what it means, when you listen to something and follow what is being said, your brain extracts the patterns. It does this silently, below the level of conscious awareness, the same way it built your first language. Over time, through enough of this input, the language begins to feel automatic. Words stop being retrieved. They start being produced. But here is what the input hypothesis alone does not fully explain, and what Krashen himself had to account for in a later part of his theory. Even when people have been exposed to enormous amounts of comprehensible input, they sometimes still cannot speak. They understand well, they read well, but speaking remains blocked. Krashen called this the affective filter. The idea is that emotional states, anxiety, self-consciousness, fear of judgment, act like a filter that prevents the acquired language from flowing into speech. The language is there, behind the filter. The filter is keeping it from coming out. This is where the neuroscience gets fascinating. Modern brain imaging studies have confirmed and expanded what Krashen theorized. When a person who speaks a second language is in a low-stress, supportive environment and simply uses the language to communicate, their brain activates the kind of deep, automatic processing associated with acquired knowledge. The language feels easy, it flows. But when the same person is placed under evaluation, when they know they are being judged, when they feel the stakes of getting something wrong, different parts of the brain become active. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for conscious, rule-based thinking, goes into overdrive. The amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, fires. And in that state, speech becomes slow, halting, error-ridden, not because the person's English has gotten worse, but because the wrong part of the brain is now running the show. Think about that for a moment. Your English does not get worse when you are nervous. Your ability to access it does. And this is why so many learners report the strange phenomenon of being much better at English when they are relaxed, when they have had a glass of wine, when they are talking to a child or to someone they trust completely. It is not the wine that improves your English. It is the relaxation. It is the lowering of the filter. The brain, no longer on threat alert, allows the acquired language to flow. So what do you do with this knowledge? First, you stop judging your ability to speak as a measure of your actual English. If you can read this and understand every word, your English is already at a significant level. The speaking problem is a different problem. It is a performance problem, not a knowledge problem. And performance problems have performance solutions, not more grammar study, not more memorization, but specific work on the conditions under which you produce language. Second, you begin to shift your input from conscious study to absorbed exposure. Instead of another grammar lesson, you spend time with English that interests you: podcasts, films, books, conversations, anything where meaning is present and you are engaged. You do not analyze it. You do not stop every sentence to look up words or identify structures. You let it wash over you. You absorb. Your brain does the rest. Third, you begin to understand that the journey from learned knowledge to acquired fluency is not a matter of studying harder. It is a matter of building new neural pathways through repeated, meaningful exposure and use. And that journey takes time, but it is not a mystery. Every hour you spend truly engaged with English, in a low-pressure context, is an hour of real acquisition happening in your brain, whether you can feel it or not. The trap you have been caught in was this. You measured your English by your ability to perform it under pressure, and when you could not perform it perfectly, you concluded that you needed to learn more. So you went back and studied more rules, memorized more vocabulary, completed more exercises. And then you tried to speak again, and the same thing happened, and you concluded again that you needed to study more. It was a loop with no exit. The exit is here. The exit is understanding that what you need is not more knowledge. What you need is more acquisition, more automatic pattern building, and this is the subject of the rest of this book. You need to systematically dismantle the filter that is preventing what you already know from coming out. You built the English inside you. Now it is time to learn how to live in it. Chapter 2. The Threat Brain. Why your nervous system is sabotaging your speech. Let us talk about a man named Paul MacLean. In the 1960s, MacLean proposed a model of the human brain that he called the triune brain, the idea that the human brain is really three brains layered on top of each other, each evolved at a different stage of our development. At the base, the oldest and most primitive brain is the reptilian complex concerned entirely with survival, reflexes, and automatic behavior. Above it sits the limbic system, sometimes called the mammalian brain, which processes emotion, memory, and social bonding. And on top of that, the most recently evolved structure is the neocortex, the seat of language, reasoning, creativity, and everything we typically think of as distinctly human. MacLean's model has been refined and challenged over the decades, and modern neuroscience is more nuanced. But the basic insight that the brain contains an ancient emotional survival system that operates faster and more powerfully than its newer rational systems has only become more solid with research. And understanding this architecture is essential if you want to understand why you freeze when you try to speak English in front of other people. Here is what happens physiologically when you find yourself in a situation where you have to speak English and you feel pressure. Your brain detects a potential threat, not a bear, not a fire, but something that registers to your nervous system as danger, the possibility of judgment, of looking foolish, of being evaluated and found lacking. The brain does not actually care whether the threat is physical or social. It processes both through overlapping systems. Rejection by a social group was literally dangerous for most of human evolutionary history. Being cast out of the tribe meant death. Your brain evolved in that world. It is not caught up with the modern world, where a grammar mistake carries zero survival consequences. So the amygdala fires. This is a small, almond-shaped structure deep in the temporal lobe, and its job is to process emotionally significant events, especially threats. When the amygdala fires a threat response, it triggers a cascade of physiological changes. Cortisol and adrenaline flood the bloodstream. The heart rate increases. The muscles tense. Blood flow is redirected from complex cognitive processes toward the large muscles needed for fight or flight. Digestion slows. The immune system pauses. Everything non-essential to immediate survival gets temporarily shut down. What counts as non-essential to immediate survival? Your prefrontal cortex, for one. The very part of your brain responsible for complex language processing, for searching and retrieving words, for constructing sentences. It gets less blood flow, less oxygen, less neural resources when you are in a stress response. The system that needs to be running at full power in order for you to speak English fluently is the exact system that gets compromised when you feel afraid to speak English. This is not a metaphor. This is biology. You literally have less cognitive bandwidth available for language when you are stressed. Words disappear. Sentences lose their endings. Grammar rules evaporate. Not because you forgot them, because the part of your brain that accesses them has been temporarily deprioritized by a survival system that thinks you are in danger. Now, there is an important nuance here that most explanations miss. The intensity of this response is not fixed, it is calibrated. Your nervous system learns. It learns what is dangerous and what is safe. and it calibrates its threat response accordingly. This is what psychologists call sensitization and desensitization. If every time you try to speak English something bad happens, you are laughed at, corrected harshly, embarrassed, or simply fail to communicate and feel the hot flush of humiliation your nervous system logs that experience, it builds an associative memory. English speaking plus social context equals danger. And the next time that context appears, the threat response fires earlier, faster, and with greater intensity. This is why people who had particularly negative experiences in language classes, a teacher who humiliated them for a mistake, classmates who laughed, a test failure that felt catastrophic, often develop a disproportionately intense fear of speaking the language. The fear is not irrational. It is conditioned. The brain learned, from real experience, that this situation is dangerous. It is now protecting you, just excessively because it overgeneralized. But here is what this also means. The response can be reconditioned. If sensitization is the mechanism that created the problem, desensitization is the mechanism that reverses it. You can teach your nervous system through repeated, safe exposure that English speaking in social contexts does not end in danger, and gradually, over time, the threat response diminishes. The amygdala fires with less intensity, the prefrontal cortex stays online, and the language that was always there becomes accessible. The question, of course, is how to create those safe experiences, especially if every real-world opportunity feels so threatening that the very thought of it triggers the response you are trying to undo. This is where the concept of graduated exposure becomes essential. Graduated exposure is the foundation of virtually every effective treatment for anxiety-based conditions, from specific phobias to social anxiety disorder. The principle is elegantly simple. You arrange experiences along a hierarchy from least threatening to most threatening, and you work your way up the hierarchy slowly, allowing your nervous system to fully habituate at each level before moving to the next. For language-speaking anxiety, a graduated exposure hierarchy might look something like this. At the lowest level, you speak English entirely alone to yourself, to your reflection in a mirror, to your phone's voice recorder. There is no social risk at all. The amygdala barely fires, if it fires at all. You do this until it feels completely natural, until your voice finds its rhythm and your sentences flow. Then you move up one level. You speak English to someone you trust completely, a close friend, a family member, someone who will not judge you, someone in whose presence you feel genuinely safe. You are still in a social context, but the threat level is low. You habituate at this level. Then you move to digital contexts. Text-based chat with a stranger or a language exchange app where you know little about the other person, where the stakes are minimal. A stranger online cannot diminish you in any meaningful way. Their judgment, even if it occurs, has no real consequences for your life. Then voice calls with someone you have built a relationship with digitally before you see them. Then small group conversations. Then professional contexts. Each step slightly more challenging than the last, but none of them unbearably so, because you have built the neurological foundation at the previous level. This is not weakness. This is not avoiding the challenge. This is intelligent biological engineering. You are using the brain's own plasticity against the very pattern it created. You are writing new associations, English speaking plus social context equals safety in the same neural substrate where the old, fearful associations were written. There is another technique worth knowing here, and it comes from a somewhat unexpected direction. Research on body language and its effect on the nervous system, particularly the work of researchers like Amy Cuddy and others who have studied power posing and its effects on cortisol and testosterone, suggests that your body position literally affects your hormonal state. When you physically expand, when you stand tall, when you take up space, when you breathe deeply into your chest rather than shallowly into your throat, Your body sends signals upward to your brain that shift its threat assessment. You are not signaling prey behavior. You are signaling confidence. And remarkably, even when you do not feel confident, performing the physical posture of confidence can measurably reduce cortisol levels and increase the sense of competence. Before a situation where you know you will need to speak English, your physiology matters. Shoulders back, head up. Breath deep and slow, breathing into the belly rather than the chest, activating the parasympathetic nervous system, the rest and digest counterpart to the fight or flight system. This is not positive thinking. This is neurophysiology. You are manually downregulating your stress response before the conversation begins, giving your prefrontal cortex the best possible chance to stay online. There is also the matter of what you tell yourself in the moments before and during speaking. Self-talk is not trivial. Research consistently shows that what you say internally in high-pressure situations profoundly affects your performance. And one of the most counterintuitive findings in this area is that self-compassion, genuinely kind, forgiving talk toward yourself is actually more effective at improving performance under stress than motivational self-talk. Telling yourself, "It's okay if you make mistakes, everyone does," is more neurologically helpful than telling yourself, "You have to do this perfectly." The reason is that compassionate self-talk reduces the threat response, while performance pressure amplifies it. When you are about to speak English and you feel the tightening in your chest, the disappearance of your vocabulary, the stall of your sentences, what you say to yourself in that moment matters more than any grammar rule you could review. Say, "Mistakes are normal." Say, "I am allowed to take a moment." Say, "My job in this conversation is to communicate, not to perform." Say, "The other person wants to understand me, not to grade me." These are not platitudes. They are threat response regulators. Each compassionate thought is a small signal to your amygdala that the danger it detected is not as dangerous as it thought. And each of those signals, over time, recalibrates the system. Your nervous system is not your enemy. It is doing its job, the job it was built for over millions of years of evolution. But it is working with an outdated map. Your work, now, is to draw a new one. Chapter 3. The Inner Critic. Silencing the voice that evaluates every word. There is a voice in your head. You know the one. It speaks English better than you do, or at least it thinks it does. It has been following you through every English conversation you have tried to have, and its job, its relentless, exhausting, confidence-destroying job, is to evaluate everything you say before, during, and after you say it. Before, "You are going to get this wrong. You always get this wrong. Just stay quiet." During, "That was the wrong tense. Was that right? No, that was not right. They noticed. Keep going. No, stop, you said it wrong again." After, "Why did you say it like that? A 5-year-old speaks better than that. You embarrassed yourself. You always do this." If this sounds familiar, you are in extremely good company. This voice, called in psychology the inner critic, or more technically, the self-monitoring system, is not unique to language learners. Every human being has one, but in people who are anxious about a particular performance domain, whether it is public speaking or athletic performance or playing a musical instrument, the inner critic becomes abnormally active during the performance itself. And for language speakers who feel self-conscious about their English, the timing and intensity of this inner criticism is particularly destructive because language is a real-time activity. The criticism arrives while you are in the middle of doing the thing, and it disrupts the very process it is supposedly trying to improve. Let us understand what is actually happening neurologically when this voice speaks. The self-monitoring function in language is real and necessary. It is what allows you to catch errors, self-correct, and maintain coherent communication. Without any self-monitoring, speech degrades. You do not realize when you have made an error. You do not track whether you are being understood. You cannot adapt to the feedback you are receiving from your conversational partner. So, self-monitoring is not the enemy. Disordered self-monitoring is. Disordered self-monitoring is what happens when the monitoring function fires too early before a word has been spoken, while it is still in formation, and too harshly, imposing standards of perfection rather than standards of communication. Linguist Meryl Swain and others who have studied language output have described what happens when speakers impose excessive monitoring on their own production. They stall. They abandon sentences midway. They oversimplify to the point where they cannot express what they actually mean, because the safer, shorter, more certain sentence is the one least likely to trigger criticism. They speak a constrained, cramped version of the language, not because that is their level, but because it is the level at which the inner critic quiets down enough to let them through. Think about that. You are actively performing below your level because your inner critic has trained you to stay in the safe zone. The sentence you actually want to say, the complex, nuanced, fully expressive sentence, gets suppressed and replaced with a shorter, blunter one, because the shorter one is less likely to be wrong. This is what I call the compression effect of the inner critic. Every learner has a gap between their actual level and their performed level. The gap is not a gap in knowledge. It is a gap created by monitoring anxiety. And closing that gap, accessing your real level in real time, requires not more grammar study, but a specific kind of internal work with this critical voice. The first thing to understand about the inner critic is where it came from. It was not born with you, it was constructed, largely through your educational experiences. Every language classroom you ever sat in was, in some measure, an evaluation environment. Someone in authority was assessing your English and giving you feedback. Sometimes that feedback was kind and encouraging, often it was not. Even when it was well-intentioned, the very structure of the classroom where you produce language and someone evaluates it wired your brain to associate language production with external judgment. And over time, your brain internalized that external judge. It built a copy of the teacher inside your head, a copy that goes everywhere you go and continues to assess you even when no actual teacher is present. This is a known psychological process. We internalize the voices and standards of authority figures, particularly those who shaped us during critical learning periods. The inner critic is not your voice. Or rather, it is your voice. But it is your voice speaking with borrowed authority, speaking in patterns that were originally external and have become internal. Understanding this does not make the voice disappear, but it does change your relationship to it. When the inner critic fires during a conversation and says, "You got that wrong," you can now hear it differently. You can hear it as a conditioned response, not as truth. You can hear it as the ghost of a teacher or a classroom, not as an accurate assessment of your English in this moment. That separation, even a slight one, gives you enough psychological distance to keep speaking despite the voice, rather than stopping because of it. There are several evidence-based strategies for working with the inner critic in language production. The first is called diffusion, a technique from acceptance and commitment therapy developed by psychologist Stephen Hayes. Diffusion is not about arguing with the inner critic or trying to prove it wrong. It is about changing the form in which you hear it so that it loses its literal grip on you. Instead of hearing the thought, "I am making mistakes and people are judging me," as a fact about reality, you hear it as just a thought. You might mentally prefix it with, "My mind is telling me that." My mind is telling me that I am making mistakes and people are judging me. That small addition creates a subtle but significant shift. The thought is no longer fused with reality. It is just something your mind is producing, the same way your mind produces visual images and sensations and memories. It is data, not truth. The second strategy is redefining success in the performance. The inner critic operates with a specific standard: perfect grammar, perfect pronunciation, perfect fluency, no pauses, no errors, no hesitations. That standard is not only unrealistic, it is not even how native speakers communicate. Native speakers make grammatical errors constantly. They pause, they backtrack, They use filler words, they lose their train of thought, they mispronounce things. The idea that real, successful communication is clean and error-free is a fantasy created by textbooks and edited writing, not by actual spoken language. When you redefine success as communication, was my meaning understood? Did the conversation move forward? Did I express something I needed to express? The inner critic standards become obviously inappropriate. It is like being judged on your performance as a chef by criteria designed for a ballet dancer. The critique does not apply. The third strategy is deliberate attention shifting. The inner critic thrives when your attention is directed inward, when you are focused on your own performance, on your own mouth, and words and errors. Research in sports psychology, music performance, and language production has consistently found that performance improves dramatically when attention is directed outward toward the task, toward the other person, toward the content of what is being communicated. In language, this means actively focusing on what you are trying to say, not on how you are saying it. It means paying attention to the other person's face, their reactions, their responses. It means being present in the communication rather than watching yourself from the outside. This is easier said than done, but it can be practiced. One useful exercise is conversation drills, where you are so focused on the content, on asking real questions you genuinely want answered, on describing things you actually care about, on telling a story you are actually invested in, that the monitoring function gets crowded out. You cannot self-monitor as intensely when you are genuinely absorbed in meaning. Genuine engagement is the enemy of the inner critic. The fourth strategy concerns the post-conversation debrief. Most language-anxious speakers engage in a particular form of post-event processing after a conversation. They replay it, hunting for mistakes, tallying errors, building a case for why they are not good at English. This rumination is not helpful analysis. It is a reinforcement of the threat association, another log on the fire, that tells your nervous system that English conversations are dangerous and disappointing. The alternative is not to pretend the conversation was perfect. The alternative is to conduct an honest but fair debrief one that notes what worked, what you were able to communicate, where you surprised yourself, alongside and with equal weight to what felt difficult. Over time, a balanced post-event processing habit rewires the associations your brain builds from speaking experience. Instead of every conversation leaving a residue of shame, it begins to leave a residue of learning and incremental confidence. None of this is about silencing the inner critic permanently. That is neither possible nor desirable. A functional monitoring system is part of what makes us effective communicators. The goal is to turn down the volume to a level where it is a background advisor, not a foreground tyrant. The goal is to reach a point where the inner critic can speak, and you can choose whether to act on what it says instead of the current situation where it speaks, and you have no choice at all. That choice is freedom, and it is available to you. It just requires building it deliberately, one conversation at a time. Chapter 4. The Identity Lock. Why you do not yet feel like an English speaker. In 1987, a psychologist named James Paul G. published a paper that would quietly transform the way many researchers thought about language learning. G. argued that language is not just a communication tool. Language is an identity performance. When you use a language, you are not just encoding and transmitting information. You are enacting a version of yourself, a social identity, complete with values, roles, affiliations, and ways of being in the world. This idea has enormous and largely unappreciated consequences for second language speakers. When you speak your first language, your mother tongue, you are completely at home in the identity it carries. Your first language holds your childhood, your family, your humor, your shades of feeling, your ability to be subtle, to be sarcastic, to be tender, to tell your own story in your own way. You know exactly who you are in your first language. The identity is not a costume. It is your skin. When you shift to a second language, something psychologically uncomfortable happens. You are no longer the person you know how to be. In English, you are younger, simpler, less precise, less funny, less emotionally nuanced. You cannot tell the same kind of story. You cannot express the same quality of thought. The complex, layered, fully realized person you are in your first language gets reduced, in the second language, to something that feels thinner and less true. This is not a problem with your English. This is a problem of identity transition, the period in which your first language self exists fully, and your English language self has not yet been built. And the discomfort of inhabiting that thinner version of yourself, of being heard as simpler than you are, of having your ideas compressed into less sophisticated expressions than they deserve, that discomfort is real and legitimate. Many people respond to it by simply not speaking, by choosing the discomfort of silence over the discomfort of misrepresentation. If I do not speak, at least no one will mistake this halting version of me for the real me. But here is the trap. The English language self only gets built through use. It grows through speaking, through making mistakes, through finding the English words for your particular way of seeing the world, through discovering that humor can exist in this language too, that tenderness is possible here, that you can eventually be as precisely yourself in English as you are in your first language. But none of that construction happens until you start using the language even in its incomplete, early, imprecise form. You have to move into the house before you can furnish it. The identity lock, the state in which your brain refuses to speak English because it does not yet identify as an English speaker, is one of the most underestimated obstacles in language acquisition. And it works in a specific, insidious way. Because you do not identify as an English speaker, your brain categorizes English as foreign, something external, something you put on and take off. And it treats the errors and imperfections of your English not as a normal part of the learning process, but as evidence of the foreignness. Evidence that English is not really yours, that you are a fraud every time you try to use it. This is the imposter phenomenon in language form. The same psychological mechanism that makes a successful professional feel like a fraud, despite all evidence of competence, is what makes a proficient English learner feel like they are pretending every time they open their mouth. How do you break the identity lock? How do you build an English language self that your brain recognizes as genuinely you? The first part of the answer involves understanding that your English identity is not a replacement for your first language identity. It is an addition. People who speak multiple languages do not have multiple selves competing for space. They have a single, complex self expressed differently across languages and contexts. You have always had multiple registers, even in your first language. The way you speak with your grandmother is different from the way you speak with your closest friend, which is different from the way you speak with your boss, which is different from the way you speak when you are nervous versus when you are relaxed. These are not separate identities. They are facets of one complex person. Your English self is a new facet, not a replacement or a diminishment. The second part involves deliberate character construction. This might sound strange, but it works, and there is a long history of language teachers recommending it. Give your English self a name if you need to, or simply give it a character, a version of you that is confident in English, comfortable with uncertainty, unbothered by mistakes, genuinely curious about and engaged with the language. Some people find it helpful to adopt certain mannerisms when speaking English, a particular posture, a particular pace of speech that signal to themselves, "I am now in English mode." This person makes mistakes and does not care about them. This person is learning out loud. This is not about pretending to be someone you are not. It is about creating enough psychological distance from your anxious, self-monitoring first language self to let the English out. It is about giving yourself permission to be imperfect in this language, which your first language self, the complete, sophisticated, fully realized version, has never had to be. The third part involves language ownership. This is perhaps the deepest mindset shift in the book. English is not a foreign language. That is to say, there is no reason you should feel like a guest in English. There are over 1 billion people in the world who speak English as a second or additional language, and many of them speak it with incredible confidence and fluency. The idea that English belongs to native speakers to the British, or the Americans, or the Australians, and that everyone else is merely borrowing it, is a profoundly destructive myth. English has been shaped by speakers of every language in the world. It carries the fingerprints of hundreds of cultures. It is a global language, and as a global language, it belongs to anyone who uses it. More than that, your particular accent, your particular usage patterns, your particular way of constructing sentences, these are not defects. They are the contribution you make to a living, evolving language. The most vibrant English being spoken in the world today is not the English of BBC News readers. It is the English of Nigerians and Indians and Pakistanis and Brazilians and Koreans people who have made the language their own, who have bent it toward their own cultural realities, who have poured themselves into it and claimed it. That kind of ownership, assertive, confident, creative ownership, is available to you. The fourth part involves finding English in contexts where you naturally identify positively. This is a strategy based on something language acquisition researchers call identity investment. You acquire and use language more effectively in contexts where you identify with the people using that language, where you want to be part of that community, where the language is associated with things you value and enjoy. If you love certain English language music, or films, or podcasts, or books, or online communities, those are your identity bridges into the language. They are contexts where you are not a stranger in English. You are a participant, a fan, a member. The language in those contexts is not foreign, it is familiar. Spend more time in English language contexts that feel like home, even if they are virtual, even if they are one-sided for now. A podcast you listen to every day, even if you never interact with the host, builds a relationship. A YouTube channel you follow builds a community. A novelist whose work you have read 3 times becomes a kind of companion. These relationships are real, and they do the same psychological work as human relationships. They make English feel inhabited, personal, claimed. The identity lock is not permanent. It was not born with you. It was built through a combination of limited experience and the entirely human tendency to protect our sense of self from perceived diminishment. But you are not diminished by speaking English imperfectly. You are in the process of becoming something richer, a person who can exist fully in more than one language, who has more than one way of moving through the world. That is not a smaller life. That is a larger one. Chapter 5. The Perfectionism Paradox. How high standards are keeping you silent. Perfectionism is considered a virtue in most cultures. We admire the person who will not submit work until it is right, who holds themselves to high standards, who cares deeply about quality. In many domains, this admiration is deserved. A surgeon who accepts nothing less than perfect technique saves lives. An engineer who insists on precise calculations builds bridges that hold. Perfectionism in the service of craft, in the right context, is a genuine strength. But perfectionism applied to language learning is not a strength. It is a cognitive trap that systematically prevents you from doing the very thing, using the language that would eventually satisfy the perfectionist's standards. Let me explain what the perfectionism paradox is, exactly. The perfectionist language learner holds a standard. I will speak English when I can speak it well. I will join conversations when I can contribute accurately. I will use complex vocabulary when I am sure I am using it correctly. I will express nuanced ideas when I can express them with the grammar they require. Until then, I will wait. I will study more. I will prepare more thoroughly. And when I am ready, when I have reached the level I need to reach, I will speak. The problem is that readiness in language does not arrive through preparation alone. It arrives through use. The only way to become a fluent English speaker is to speak English imperfectly and repeatedly in real contexts, making real mistakes, recovering from them, and building through that accumulated experience the kind of automatic, natural proficiency that the perfectionist is waiting to have before they begin. You cannot prepare your way into fluency. You have to speak your way into it. This is the paradox. The perfectionist is waiting to speak until their English is good enough, but their English will never become good enough without speaking. It is like a swimmer who refuses to enter the water until they have learned to swim. The learning happens in the water. There is no way around it. Now, perfectionism in language learning does not always feel like perfectionism. It disguises itself as other things. It disguises itself as politeness. I do not want to waste the other person's time with my poor English. It disguises itself as humility. I do not want to pretend I am better than I am. It disguises itself as professionalism. In my field, the stakes are too high to make errors. These rationalizations are genuine in the sense that the person believes them, but they are still perfectionism in costume. They are still the same belief. My English is not good enough to use, and using it imperfectly would be worse than not using it at all. The cognitive distortion underlying this belief is called all-or-nothing thinking. In all-or-nothing thinking, there are only two states: perfect and worthless. A piece of English that is 90% accurate is coded by the perfectionist's brain the same way as a piece of English that is 40% accurate as failure, as not good enough, as something to be hidden rather than used. The nuance, the progress, the genuine communicative value of imperfect but meaningful English simply does not register. What does research say about the relationship between errors and language acquisition? It says something the perfectionist will find deeply uncomfortable. Errors are not just inevitable in language learning. They are necessary. This is not a feel-good consolation. It is a mechanistic fact about how language learning works in the brain. Errors signal to the neural system that the current output does not match the target, and that signal is what drives the brain to adjust, to build more accurate patterns, to seek and incorporate corrective feedback. A language learner who never makes errors is a language learner who is never trying anything new, never pushing beyond their comfort zone, never generating the kind of output that the brain needs in order to grow. Error correction, done thoughtfully and in the right context, is one of the most powerful accelerators of language acquisition. But you can only be corrected if you speak. You can only generate output if you try. You can only try if you are willing to be wrong. Stephen Krashen himself identified what he called the output hypothesis, developed further by Merrill Swain, which proposes that producing language speaking and writing is itself an important part of acquisition, separate from input. When you try to say something and realize you cannot say it the way you want to, that recognition of a gap in your knowledge is valuable. It activates a search for the resources to fill the gap. Your brain flags the missing piece and begins looking for it in subsequent input. You start to notice things you previously overlooked. Producing imperfect output, in other words, makes you a more efficient acquirer of input. Perfectionism, by suppressing output, suppresses acquisition. There is also a physical component to this. Language production, actual speaking, involves a motor skill component. Your mouth, tongue, lips, and breath need to coordinate in specific ways to produce English sounds. This is a genuine physical skill, like playing an instrument or executing a sports technique, and physical skills develop through repetition and approximation, not through perfection. When you refuse to speak imperfect English, you are also refusing to do the physical practice your speech organs need to build the muscle memory of English pronunciation and rhythm. The only way to get better at the physical act of speaking English is to physically speak English, regardless of whether the output is perfect. Here is another dimension of the perfectionism paradox that is rarely discussed. the way perfectionism affects your listener. People who are anxious about speaking English often believe that their errors are highly noticeable and deeply bothersome to native speakers and proficient speakers. This belief is almost always wrong. In reality, most listeners in a genuine communicative exchange are focused on meaning, not form. They are following your idea, not auditing your grammar. Research on native speaker listening behavior consistently finds that form errors, wrong tenses, misused prepositions, article mistakes are largely filtered out by the attentive listener's brain as long as the meaning is clear. The listener's brain performs automatic error correction, the same way it fills in misheard words based on context. You are far more aware of your errors than anyone listening to you is. Moreover, there is strong evidence that many listeners, particularly those who have any experience with multilingual communication, actively admire the effort and courage involved in using a second language. They know it is hard. They know it requires vulnerability. A speaker who communicates with confidence and warmth despite imperfect grammar is experienced by most listeners not as incompetent, but as genuinely impressive, more impressive, in many cases, than a fluent speaker who clearly has no awareness of how lucky they are to have been born into a language. Your errors are not as visible as you think. They are not as important as you think. And even when they are noticed, they are almost never judged as harshly as the perfectionist part of your mind insists they will be. The practical work of dismantling perfectionism in language involves a specific set of what psychologists call exposure experiments, structured opportunities to test the predictions your perfectionism makes against the reality of what actually happens. Your perfectionism predicts, if I speak imperfect English, I will be judged, I will not be understood, something bad will happen. The exposure experiment asks, let me speak imperfect English and see if those predictions come true. They usually do not. Not because the world is uniformly kind, it is not, but because your perfectionism has massively overestimated both the frequency and the severity of the negative consequences it is protecting you from. Most conversations end not in judgment, but in connection. Most people who receive your imperfect English receive it graciously, because most people are more interested in what you have to say than in how you are saying it. Each exposure experiment that goes well, each conversation that ends without catastrophe, each instance of imperfect English that is received with warmth, or simply with understanding, is a data point against the perfectionist narrative. Over time, enough data points accumulate to challenge and eventually erode the cognitive distortion that has been keeping you silent. You are not waiting until you are perfect. You are starting imperfect right now. That is not lowering your standards. That is understanding, finally, what the actual standard is. The standard is communication. The standard is growth. The standard is willingness. And by those standards, an imperfect sentence spoken is infinitely more valuable than a perfect sentence left unspoken. Chapter 6. The Fluency Illusion. What real English conversation actually looks like. There is a version of fluency in your head. You have been carrying it around for years. It is the standard against which you measure every English utterance you produce, and against which you inevitably fall short. In this version of fluency, English flows like a clean, uninterrupted river. Sentences complete themselves perfectly. There are no pauses to search for a word, no backtracking to correct a phrase, no moments where the thought outruns the language. The fluent speaker in your imagination moves through the language with ease, always precise, always confident, always articulate. This version of fluency does not exist. I am not saying that fluency is a myth. I am saying that the version of fluency you have constructed in your imagination, the version you are comparing yourself to and finding yourself hopelessly lacking, is a fantasy, and not a harmless fantasy. It is an actively destructive one, because it has set you an impossible standard and then let you believe that real, proficient speakers effortlessly achieve it. Here is what real, natural conversation in English, even among native speakers, actually looks like when you transcribe it and read it back. It looks like this. So I was just trying to figure out what to do about the situation with, my manager, and she said, and I was like, okay, I hear you, but I do not know. It just seems like there is something bigger going on. And I thought maybe probably I should talk to her again, but I was kind of, it did not feel right. That is a native speaker speaking casually. That is not someone who is struggling or failing to communicate. That is how human conversation works. It is full of filler words, kind of, sort of, It backtracks, it uses incomplete sentences, it repeats words, it trails off, it restarts. It is messy in a way that is entirely normal and entirely acceptable and entirely overlooked by everyone participating in the conversation because no one is monitoring the grammar of casual speech. They are following the meaning. The meaning is perfectly clear. But when a second language speaker produces something that looks similar on paper, filler words, hesitations, imprecise vocabulary, incomplete sentences, they experience it as failure. They compare it not to the real speech of real native speakers, but to the idealized, edited performance standard version of fluency they have been sold. And the comparison produces shame, when in reality, the comparison is between your imperfect natural speech and an image that does not correspond to anything real. This matters practically because one of the key psychological barriers to speaking is the belief that something drastically different should be coming out of your mouth, that you should be producing polished, edited, perfect English. And because you are not producing that, because instead you are producing the same kind of halting, filler-filled, imperfect speech that all humans produce in natural conversation, you conclude that you are failing. You are not failing. You are speaking like a human being. Understanding this, really absorbing it, requires that you actually listen to natural spoken English, not the performed English of films or news broadcasts or TED Talks, but the actual English of real conversations. The kind of English you find in reality television, in unscripted podcasts, in casual interviews, in everyday exchanges between people talking about nothing in particular. When you listen to enough of that, the fantasy version of fluency starts to dissolve. You start to hear how much breathing room there is in real English, how much imperfection is not only tolerated, but normal. There is also an important distinction between fluency and accuracy that most language learners collapse into a single thing. Fluency refers to the ability to communicate smoothly and spontaneously, without excessive pausing or blocking. Accuracy refers to the degree to which your language conforms to the rules of the target language. These are separate dimensions. A speaker can be highly fluent, but not particularly accurate. They speak naturally, without hesitation, but they make many errors. A speaker can be highly accurate, but not very fluent. They know the rules well and rarely make mistakes, but they speak slowly, with long pauses, constantly monitoring themselves. Research consistently shows that fluency development and accuracy development are actually in tension, and that pushing too hard for accuracy undermines fluency. The self-monitoring required to maximize accuracy slows down speech, increases hesitation, and produces exactly the kind of halting performance that feels like failing. The way to develop fluency is to prioritize communication over correctness, to speak first, monitor later. Accuracy will improve on its own over time as input increases and patterns become more automatic. Fluency, however, only develops through practice in prioritizing flow. This is why virtually every expert in communicative language teaching emphasizes that accuracy correction during fluency practice is counterproductive. If you are practicing speaking and your teacher or conversation partner corrects every error you make in real time, your fluency practice becomes accuracy. Practice you slow down, you monitor more, you produce less. The environment rewards careful, monitored production rather than natural, flowing production. And you get better at the wrong thing. Effective fluency practice separates these two modes. In fluency mode, you speak. You speak without stopping to self-correct, without backtracking to fix a grammar error, without changing a sentence midway because you realized it was going in the wrong direction. You finish your sentences, even if they are wrong. You keep talking, even if you are uncertain. You trust the communication to carry meaning, even if the form is imperfect, and you do not judge yourself afterward by whether every sentence was correct. Accuracy mode is separate. In accuracy mode, you review. You notice patterns of error. You study the structures that your fluency practice revealed as gaps. You practice specific forms in controlled contexts. And then you go back to fluency practice with those forms slightly stronger in your system. These two modes do not mix. The language learner who tries to be accurate and fluent simultaneously in every speaking moment ends up being neither. There is a related concept here that is worth understanding: the notion of acceptable loss in communication. In any given sentence you produce in English, some information may be slightly imprecise, some grammar may not be perfectly formed, some vocabulary may not be exactly the right word. This is acceptable. Communication does not require perfection. It requires sufficient overlap between what you intend to convey and what the listener understands. Native speakers operate with acceptable loss all the time. They use approximations. They say roughly when they mean exactly. They say a lot of when they mean the specific number. They use metaphors and idioms that blur precision in service of expressiveness. Imprecision is not a bug in natural language, it is a feature. Language is a fuzzy, imperfect, context-dependent tool, and it works remarkably well despite that, or because of that. The fuzziness is part of what makes it flexible enough to handle the full complexity of human experience. When you let go of the fluency illusion, when you replace the fantasy of perfect, flowing, error-free speech with an accurate picture of what real human conversation looks and sounds like, something liberating happens. You stop feeling like you are failing a standard that everyone else is meeting. You start to see yourself as doing what all humans do, using an imprecise, context-dependent, wonderfully messy tool to connect with other humans. And in that context, your English is not inadequate. It is sufficient. More than sufficient. It is doing its job. The fluency illusion was always going to hold you back. The truth about fluency sets you free. Chapter 7. The Silence Habit. Breaking the loop that keeps you from speaking. Here is something counterintuitive that most people who avoid speaking English have not fully appreciated. Silence is not a neutral state. It is not simply the absence of speaking. Silence is an active behavior that your brain learns, practices, and gets better at. Every time you choose silence over speech in a situation where you could have spoken English, you are not just missing an opportunity, you are practicing silence. You are strengthening the neural pathway of choosing not to speak. You are making it slightly easier to choose silence the next time. This is what psychologists call avoidance reinforcement. When a situation feels threatening, and speaking English often feels threatening, for all the reasons we have discussed, avoidance reduces the anxiety. Not speaking feels better in the immediate term than speaking and risking the anxiety that comes with it. And because the avoidance reduces the discomfort, the brain registers it as a success. The anxiety went away. The strategy worked. Do it again next time. Except the anxiety did not actually go away. It was deferred. The situation that triggered it is still there, slightly more charged for having been avoided. And the next time it comes up, the avoidance will be triggered a little earlier, at a slightly lower provocation threshold. Over time, the range of situations that trigger the silence habit expands. What started as avoiding large group conversations in English expands to avoiding one-on-one conversations, which expands to avoiding any situation where English might come up, which eventually can expand to avoiding any social situation at all, because any social situation might require English. This is how avoidance spirals. And breaking an avoidance spiral requires understanding that you cannot simply decide to stop avoiding. The decision to stop avoiding must be paired with a strategy for tolerating the discomfort that avoidance was managing and with actual structured exposure to the avoided situation in a form that is manageable enough to attempt. The silence habit, specifically the habit of choosing not to speak when you could have spoken, has several distinct forms that are worth naming separately because different forms require slightly different interventions. The first form is anticipatory silence. This is what happens before you enter a situation you know will require English. The anxiety begins in advance. You rehearse potential conversations, and they all go badly in your imagination. You think of reasons to avoid the situation, entirely reasons that are plausible and reasonable sounding, but whose real function is anxiety management. You cancel the meeting, skip the social event, avoid the phone call. The silence happens before you even open your mouth. The intervention for anticipatory silence is behavioral scheduling, committing to the situation in advance, in ways that make it harder to back out, and preparing specifically for it with manageable exposure. If you know you have to make a phone call in English, schedule it. Tell someone else about it. Prepare a few opening sentences. Lower the barrier to starting and raise the social cost of canceling. The second form is situational silence. This is what happens in the moment you are in a conversation. You have something to say, and you choose not to say it. You find a reason to defer. You wait for a better moment. You decide the thing you were going to say is not worth saying. The moment passes. You stay silent. The intervention for situational silence is a commitment device, a promise you make to yourself before entering a conversation that you will say at least one thing. Not perfectly, not impressively. Just one thing. The first time you say that one thing and the world does not end, you have evidence against the silence habit. And the next time, the commitment is to two things. This is a form of graduated exposure applied to the specific moment of speaking, and it works because it is genuinely manageable. One sentence. You can do one sentence. The third form is reactive silence. This is the silence that occurs as a reaction to something going wrong. You said something, and someone did not understand, or someone corrected you, or you felt embarrassed and you go quiet in response. The reactive silence is the silence of shame, and it tends to last longer than the original uncomfortable moment warranted. The intervention for reactive silence requires rebuilding your protocol for handling communicative difficulty. When someone does not understand you, what do? If your current protocol is to go quiet and defer, you need to replace it with an active protocol. Repeat yourself more slowly, rephrase, try a different vocabulary, use your hands, draw it if necessary. Communicative repair, the process of fixing a misunderstanding in progress, is a skill that can be explicitly learned and practiced. The more competent you become at repair, the less threatening communicative failure feels. Because you know what to do when it happens, you have a next move. And the silence habit loses its grip precisely because silence is no longer the only option when things go wrong. The fourth form is habitual silence. The silence that has become so automatic you do not even notice it anymore. You do not experience a choice. In English contexts, you simply do not speak. It is not a decision. It is a default. This is the most entrenched form of the silence habit, and it requires the most deliberate intervention. In cases of habitual silence, the first step is often just awareness, noticing the pattern, tracking when it occurs, identifying the contexts in which it is most reliable. Once the pattern is visible, it becomes possible to work with it. You cannot change a behavior you cannot see. There is a technique used in behavioral psychology called behavioral activation, originally developed for depression, which has striking parallels to what is needed here. Behavioral activation is based on the observation that in depression, people withdraw from activities, and that withdrawal makes the depression worse. It reduces positive reinforcement from the environment, which deepens the low mood, which leads to further withdrawal. The intervention is to activate behavior before the emotional state changes. You act as if you were not depressed. You engage, you reach out, you pursue activities, and the emotional state shifts as a result of the behavior, not before it. The same logic applies to the silence habit. You do not wait until you feel confident to speak. You speak, and confidence follows from the evidence that speaking is survivable. You do not wait until the fear is gone to expose yourself to the feared situation. You enter the situation with the fear still present, and the fear diminishes as a result of the exposure. The behavior change comes first. The internal state change follows. This reverses the usual assumption, the assumption that you need to feel ready before you can act. You do not need to feel ready. Readiness comes from acting. Every sentence you produce in English, even a short one, even an imperfect one, is your nervous system receiving a lesson. And the lesson is, I spoke, I survived, it is safe. Enough of those lessons, accumulated over time, rewrite the habit. The silence that once felt protective becomes recognizable as a trap, and the speaking that once felt dangerous begins to feel, eventually, like the most natural thing in the world. Chapter 8. The Input Revolution. How to feed your brain the English it actually needs. We established early in this book that language acquisition, the deep, automatic, intuitive kind of English mastery that allows you to speak without thinking, requires not more grammar study but more comprehensible input. Now let us get specific, because input is not all equal. The kind of input that drives acquisition and the kind that merely passes the time are different, and understanding the difference will help you spend your language hours far more efficiently. Krashen's comprehensible input hypothesis says, most simply, that you acquire language when you understand messages. The message must be comprehensible, you must be able to extract its meaning. But it must also be slightly beyond your current level, what Krashen called I+1, where I is your current level and 1 represents a small additional challenge. If the input is too easy, you are not acquiring anything new. If it is too hard, comprehension breaks down and acquisition stops. The sweet spot is input that challenges you slightly, that requires you to infer and guess and use context, but that remains meaningful. In practical terms, this means that the most effective input for a high intermediate English learner is not English learner materials slow, simplified, drained of idiom and complexity. It is real English, used by real speakers for real purposes, in contexts that are so familiar or interesting to you that the unfamiliar language elements can be resolved by context. A documentary about a subject you know well, a podcast in a field where you have expertise, a book in a genre you love. The familiarity of the subject provides the scaffolding that makes slightly unfamiliar language comprehensible. This is also why input that you are emotionally engaged with is more effective than input that you merely endure. When you are genuinely interested, genuinely entertained, genuinely moved, when you actually care what happens next, your brain is processing meaning with full engagement. It is not just tracking words. It is building a model of the world the text is describing, connecting language to ideas and emotions and images, creating the rich, multidimensional representations that make words stick. This is acquisition. This is the brain doing exactly what it was designed to do when it encounters meaningful language. Contrast this with studying a grammar textbook you find boring, or completing a vocabulary exercise about topics that are irrelevant to your life. The language input may be comprehensible and grammatically correct, but it is emotionally inert. It does not engage the deeper systems. It goes into explicit memory where it can be retrieved consciously, tested on exams, used when you have time to think, but it does not go into the automatic system. It does not become fluency. The first principle of effective input is therefore this: make it meaningful, make it interesting, make it engaging. Not because language learning should be comfortable and easy, but because the neuroscience of acquisition demands real cognitive and emotional engagement. Boredom is not just unpleasant, it is inefficient. The second principle concerns quantity. There is no escaping this one. Acquisition requires massive exposure. The researchers who have studied the question most carefully suggest that reaching a high intermediate level of English requires somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 hours of substantive engagement with the language. That number sounds daunting, but it is important to put it in perspective. It does not mean 2,000 hours of textbook study. It means 2,000 hours of actual engagement reading, listening, watching, conversing, thinking in the language. If you spend 2 hours a day genuinely engaged with English, reading something you enjoy, watching something you are interested in, listening to a podcast while exercising, you are building acquisition in a way that no classroom course can replicate. The third principle is about modality diversity. Different modalities of input develop different aspects of the language. Reading exposes you to wider vocabulary, more complex sentence structures, and more formal registers. Listening exposes you to natural pronunciation, rhythm, intonation, and the patterns of spontaneous speech. Conversation exposes you to the turn-taking dynamics of real interaction, to the pragmatic rules of how language is used socially, to the way meaning is negotiated between speakers in real time. All three modalities are valuable, and they complement each other in ways that make combined input more powerful than any one modality alone. For speaking specifically, listening to natural speech is the most directly relevant input. When you listen to a great deal of natural English podcasts, audiobooks read by expressive narrators, interviews, unscripted conversations, you are doing something more than language learning. You are building a phonological model of English in your head. You are storing the rhythms and melodies of the language at a subconscious level, and when you begin to speak, your brain draws on those stored models. Speakers who listen extensively tend to develop more natural-sounding spoken English, not because they consciously imitated anything, but because their brains had a rich acoustic template to work from. This is why shadowing, a technique in which you listen to English and simultaneously speak along with the speaker, mirroring their words, rhythm, and intonation, is one of the most powerful spoken language development techniques available. Shadowing was developed and promoted most notably by Alexander Arguelles, a remarkable polyglot who used it to achieve high proficiency in dozens of languages. It works because it combines listening and speaking simultaneously. You are receiving input and producing output at the same time, and you are using the speaker's model to calibrate your own production in real time. The brain gets input and output practice simultaneously, and it gets them in a context of zero social anxiety because you are alone, and because the pressure to be original has been removed. You are just following. Shadowing can be difficult at first. Your mouth may not move as fast as the speaker. You may miss words. You may feel foolish talking to a podcast. None of that matters. The technique works even when it is imperfect. Even if you are shadowing with a 2-second delay, even if you are only getting 60% of the words, your brain is doing something valuable. It is practicing the coordination of listening and speaking. It is getting used to the simultaneity of comprehension and production. It is building the motor patterns of natural English rhythm in your speech apparatus. Do it daily, even for 15 minutes, and the effects accumulate. The fourth principle of effective input involves what researchers call noticing the conscious attention that a learner pays to specific features of the language they are encountering. Input becomes more powerful for acquisition when learners actively notice things, when they pay attention to a word they do not know, look it up, encounter it again later and recognize it, and gradually move it from passive to active vocabulary. When they notice a grammatical construction they have not used before, experiment with it in their own speech and refine it through feedback. The key word here is noticing, not analyzing. You do not need to analyze every sentence you read for its grammatical structure. You do not need to stop and look up every unfamiliar word. But when something catches your attention, a phrase that feels particularly natural, a vocabulary choice that is surprisingly precise, A structure that does something you did not know English could do, stopping to pay it conscious attention for a moment, enhances its acquisition potential. It signals to your brain, this is worth remembering. A useful practice here is maintaining what some language learners call a curiosity log, a place where you record language items that caught your attention during your input sessions, not necessarily studied them. Just notice them. The act of recording is itself a form of attention, and attention is what transforms encountered language from something you heard once to something that begins to enter your active system. The fifth principle is what I call input diversification across registers. English is not one language. It is a family of languages, informal and formal, written and spoken, regional and standard, casual and professional, emotional and neutral. Each register operates by slightly different rules, uses different vocabulary, allows different constructions. If all your input comes from one register, say, formal written English from textbooks, you will develop facility in that register and relative incompetence in others. The person who reads widely but never listens to natural conversation will be grammatically sophisticated but rhythmically flat and idiomatically foreign. The person who watches only informal television will speak naturally but write stiffly. Deliberate diversification of input registers is particularly important for speaking, because most real conversations happen in informal registers that formal education does not prepare you for. The register of a casual conversation with a colleague, the register of social small talk, the register of emotional support or friendly humor, these are all acquired primarily through exposure to those registers in action. Podcasts, casual YouTube channels, unscripted interviews, genuine personal writing, these are your teachers for the registers that matter most in daily life. You have been starving your brain of the food it actually needs, and feeding it food it was never designed to eat. More grammar charts will not build the English that lives inside you. More exposure, more absorption, more genuine engagement with the language as a living, breathing, meaning-making system, that is what your brain needs, and it is available everywhere. The revolution is simply deciding to feed it. Chapter 9. The Output Engine. Speaking more to speak better. Everything we have discussed so far, the acquisition trap, the threat brain, the inner critic, the identity lock, the perfectionism paradox, the fluency illusion, the silence habit, the input revolution, all of it has been building toward this chapter. Because at the end of all the understanding, at the end of all the psychological unpacking, at the end of all the neuroscience, there is one irreducible truth about becoming a fluent English speaker. You have to speak. Not just think about speaking, not just read about speaking, not just understand why you do not speak. You have to actually speak. And you have to speak more than you think you need to, and in more contexts than are comfortable, and with more willingness to be imperfect than feels natural. The output engine, the practice of generating spoken English consistently, purposefully, and in real communicative contexts, is the final and essential component of breaking through. But output is not just practice in the naive sense of the word. It is not simply repeating English until it becomes automatic. Research on output in language acquisition has revealed several specific mechanisms through which speaking accelerates acquisition in ways that input alone cannot produce. The first mechanism is the noticing function. When you try to say something and you cannot say it the way you want to, when you reach for a word and it is not there, or when you start a sentence and cannot finish it the way you intended, you become aware of a gap. Not the vague general awareness that your English is imperfect, but a specific, pointed awareness that this particular expression is not in your active vocabulary, or that this particular grammar structure is not yet automatic for you. That specific awareness is extraordinarily valuable. It primes your brain to notice and acquire exactly the information it needs when it encounters it in subsequent input. The gap becomes a magnetic attractor, pulling in relevant language from the environment. This is why the combination of output followed by input is particularly powerful. Speak first, discover what you are missing, then consume input that may contain those missing elements. Your brain, primed by the gaps your output revealed, will notice and absorb those elements with unusual efficiency. The output created the hunger, the input satisfies it. The second mechanism is hypothesis testing. Every time you produce English, you are implicitly making a guess, a hypothesis about how the language works. You use a word in a context and wait to see whether you were understood. You construct a sentence with a particular grammar pattern and observe whether it produces the effect you intended. You use a phrase you have encountered in input and discover whether it works in the context you placed it in. Every one of these micro-experiments generates feedback, either from your conversational partner's response or from your own growing metalinguistic awareness. And each piece of feedback refines your internal model of the language. Output is not just practice, it is experimentation. You are a scientist of your own language, and every utterance is a trial. The third mechanism is automatization. Many researchers use the term procedural learning to describe the process by which language patterns that are initially effortful and conscious become fast and automatic. Procedural learning requires practice, but specifically, it requires practice in conditions that gradually approximate the target performance. You do not automatize the grammar of English by studying grammar charts. You automatize it by using that grammar repeatedly in communicative contexts until the retrieval and production of that pattern requires no conscious effort. Think about learning to drive. In the early stages, you consciously manage every component: the mirror check, the shoulder check, the gear change, the acceleration and braking, and you cannot do anything else at the same time. Over time, with enough practice, these components become automatic. You do them without thinking, and your conscious attention is freed for other things: navigating, conversing, thinking about where you are going. Language fluency is the same. It requires the competential skills of English grammar, vocabulary, pronunciation to become procedural, automatic, backgrounded. And that automatization only happens through repeated production in real conditions. The fourth mechanism, and perhaps the most underappreciated one, is what Swain called the metalinguistic function of output. When you speak, and then reflect on what you said, when you think about how you expressed something and whether it worked, you engage in a form of analysis that is qualitatively different from studying grammar in the abstract. You are analyzing your own language in context with a communicative purpose already established. This kind of analysis is stickier, more personally meaningful, and more directly tied to your future production than any externally imposed grammar instruction. Your own speech, reflected upon, becomes one of your best teachers. Now, practically speaking, how do you build an output practice that actually works? The first component is solo speaking, deliberate speaking practice done entirely alone. This seems odd at first. Why speak to yourself? But solo speaking is extraordinarily valuable precisely because it has zero social stakes. You can speak as badly as you need to. You can pause, restart, experiment, be wrong repeatedly, try different ways of saying the same thing, explore the outer edges of your English without any fear of judgment. This is fluency practice in its purest form. Speak to yourself during your daily routines. Narrate what you are doing while you cook, exercise, or commute. Describe what you see. Give yourself verbal instructions. Argue with yourself about something. Tell yourself a story. Think out loud in English. The content does not matter. The production matters. You are building the motor habits of English speech, building the vocabulary retrieval channels, building the sentence construction patterns, and doing it in a context where imperfection carries no cost at all. Journaling in spoken form, recording yourself on your phone, speaking about your day, your thoughts. Your reactions to things adds a small additional layer of performance awareness that bridges the gap between purely private speaking and social speaking. You know the recording exists. You are slightly more aware of your output. And periodically, listening back is one of the most revealing and instructive things a language learner can do, not to criticize yourself, but to genuinely observe your English as if it were someone else's, noticing patterns and progress that are invisible when you are inside the production. The second component is structured conversation practice regular, scheduled interaction with other English speakers, ideally in low-stakes contexts where the primary purpose is communication and connection rather than evaluation. Language exchange partners are excellent for this, people who want to practice your first language in exchange for practicing English with you. The mutual vulnerability, both of you learning, both of you making mistakes, equalizes the dynamic and reduces the threat to near zero. The third component is what I call productive discomfort, deliberately entering speaking situations that are slightly more challenging than what you would choose for yourself on a regular, scheduled basis. Not terrifyingly challenging, slightly challenging. The conversation with a native speaker when you could have chosen a fellow learner. The phone call when you could have sent an email. The presentation you could have delegated. The question asked aloud in a meeting you could have written down. Each productive discomfort is a voluntary renegotiation of where your comfort zone sits. And over time, consistent voluntary discomfort expands the zone. What was terrifying becomes manageable. What was manageable becomes comfortable. What was comfortable becomes boring, which means it is time to move to the next level. The fourth component is content-based output, speaking about things you genuinely know, care about, and can speak with authority on. This is perhaps the most underutilized strategy in language learning. When you speak about a topic you know deeply, your profession, your passion, your specialized knowledge, you are not working in the dark. You know what you want to say. The cognitive burden shifts from content generation to language generation. And because the content is easy, more of your cognitive resources are available for language, which paradoxically means the language is better. A scientist speaking about their research in English will often produce significantly better English than the same scientist attempting casual small talk. Because in the research domain, the ideas are clear, the purpose is clear, the thing to be communicated is known. The language has to do less lifting, and what you learn about language in those high-competence content domains begins to transfer gradually into other domains as well. You have been waiting for the language to become ready before you use it, but the language becomes ready through being used. The engine does not warm up before you drive it. It warms up by being driven. Start the engine now. Chapter 10. The Long Game. Building a Life in English. We have traveled a long distance together in this book. We have mapped the neuroscience of language block, dismantled the myths about what it means to be bad at English, replaced the illusion of fluency with the truth of natural speech, and equipped you with tools for every layer of the obstacle, from the threat response in your nervous system to the identity resistance in your sense of self. We have looked at input and output, at the inner critic and the silence habit, at perfectionism and acquisition. And we have done all of it in service of a single practical goal, helping you use the English that is already inside you. But I want to end this book not with a technique or a tool or a strategy. I want to end it with something larger, a perspective on what it actually means to build a life in a second language, and why the work you are doing, even when it is slow and painful and full of setbacks, is worth doing. Learning to speak English confidently is not a small thing. It is not simply adding a skill to your repertoire the way you might learn to cook a new dish or play a new sport. It is a fundamental expansion of who you are and how you are able to exist in the world. Every language you speak is a window onto a different way of organizing reality. English, specifically, is a window onto an enormous, diverse, contradictory, brilliant, frustrating, creative community of people who span every culture, every nationality, every intellectual tradition on earth. When you speak English confidently, you gain access to all of them. Every book, every film, every scientific paper, every song, every conversation, every friendship, a vast proportion of what humanity is currently thinking and creating and making and saying is available to you in English and in no other language. But more than access, speaking English confidently changes your relationship to yourself. Every time you push through the silence, every time you speak despite the fear, every time you choose the productive discomfort over the safe retreat, you are practicing something that extends far beyond language. You are practicing courage. You are practicing the willingness to be imperfect in public, to be vulnerable in front of other people, to try something hard and fail, and try again. These are not just language skills, these are life skills. The person who learns to speak English despite the anxiety, who builds fluency through consistent action in the face of fear, is a different person from the one who could not. They have earned something that cannot be studied or memorized. They have earned it by doing. But I do not want to romanticize this, because romanticizing it does you no service. The truth is that the path from where you are now to confident, natural English fluency is long. It will take more time than you want it to take. It will have plateaus, periods of weeks or months where you seem to make no progress, where your English feels stuck, where the same mistakes keep coming back, where you wonder if you will ever really break through. These plateaus are a normal and inevitable feature of language acquisition. They do not mean you have stopped progressing. They mean that the progress is happening below the surface, in the neural architecture that does not show itself in immediate performance. The word that seems impossible today will suddenly emerge naturally in a conversation 3 months from now, without any additional effort, because the brain has been processing it quietly all along. Progress in language is not linear. It is not even consistently perceptible. It comes in sudden jumps after long, flat periods. It comes in moments that cannot be planned or forced, a conversation where something clicks, a film where suddenly you understand everything, a day when you realize that you have been thinking in English for an hour without noticing. These moments are not luck. They are the fruit of accumulated exposure and practice, ripening suddenly into visible progress. Trust the process, even when the progress is invisible. And there is this. The people who achieve genuine, lasting fluency in a second language are not necessarily the most talented or the most intelligent, or the ones with the best memory. They are the ones who stayed. They are the ones who kept showing up, day after day, year after year, through the plateaus and the setbacks and the moments of humiliation and the long stretches of seemingly invisible progress. Persistence is the master's skill. Everything else is secondary. How do you build the persistence necessary for the long game? The first answer is connection. Connecting your English learning to something that genuinely matters to you, some purpose larger than the language itself. Do you want to connect with specific people? Reach specific communities? Pursue specific opportunities? Advance in a specific field? Access specific knowledge? The more directly and personally meaningful your reason for learning English, the more resilient your motivation. Abstract goals, I want to be fluent, fade. Specific, personal, emotionally resonant goals endure. Know your reason, write it down, return to it when the motivation runs dry. The second answer is progress tracking the deliberate, systematic recording of where you were and where you are, so that the progress that is invisible on a daily basis becomes visible on a longer timeline. A simple journal of your English experiences, kept consistently, becomes something remarkable after a year. Reading back over entries from 12 months ago, you will often be startled by how far you have come, by things that were difficult then and are easy now, by fears that loomed large then and seem almost puzzling now. Progress is most visible in retrospect. Build the record that will let you see it. The third answer is community finding and staying connected to other people who are on the same journey. whether as fellow learners or as mentors, or as the English-speaking community you are working to join. Language learning in isolation is hard. Language learning as a member of a community, even a virtual one, even a loose one, is much more sustainable. Other people provide encouragement, accountability, honest feedback, the knowledge that you are not alone in the struggle, and the evidence, when they succeed, that success is possible. The fourth answer is celebration, the deliberate acknowledgement of progress, of courage, of showing up when it was hard. This is not self-congratulation for its own sake. It is neurological programming. Your brain strengthens the behaviors it associates with reward. When you acknowledge and celebrate the fact that you attempted something difficult today, that you spoke when you could have stayed silent, that you stayed in a conversation that was uncomfortable instead of retreating, you are reinforcing the neural circuits associated with those behaviors. You are making it slightly more likely that you will do it again tomorrow. The celebration does not have to be big, it just has to be real. And the fifth answer is perspective, the long-game perspective that allows you to hold your imperfect English today in the context of where you are going, rather than measuring it against where you wish you already were. You are not failing at fluency. You are building it. The building is the point. The building is the thing. The fluency you will have in 5 years is being assembled right now, today, by every sentence you speak, every hour of input you absorb, every uncomfortable conversation you push through, every moment of courage in the face of the threat response. It is being built in your brain, in your nervous system, in your identity, whether you can see it or not. Let me leave you with something I want you to hold. You picked up this book or turned on this recording because some part of you refused to accept the story that you are just bad at English. That part of you was right. You are not bad at English. You are blocked, and everything that creates a block can be unblocked. The science says so. The evidence of thousands of people who are exactly where you are and who broke through says so. And more than anything, the simple truth that the English you carry inside you, built over years of learning, of exposure, of effort, is already far more than enough to begin. It just needs to be let out. The block is not permanent. The silence is not forever. The wall your brain built to protect you can come down, and on the other side of that wall is not just better English. It is a version of you who has learned, through this particular hard thing, that hard things do not have to be permanent obstacles. They can be temporary walls on the way to permanent capability. That version of you has been waiting. It is time to let them out. Bonus chapter: The Conversation Blueprint. Practical frameworks for real, world English interaction. Everything in this book has been building toward real conversation, the actual, live, unpredictable, exhilarating, and terrifying event of 2 or more people using English together to navigate the world. In this bonus chapter, I want to give you something concrete, a set of frameworks and strategies that you can use in real conversations, starting with the very next one you have. These are not scripts. They are not memorized phrases you pull out and deploy. They are structural understandings, ways of seeing what a conversation is and what role you play in it that will help you orient yourself in the moment rather than feeling swept away by the current of someone else's. Fluency. The first framework is what I call the 3-second rule, and it is perhaps the single most practically useful piece of advice in this entire book. You are allowed to take 3 seconds before you respond to anything. 3 seconds is not a long time. In normal conversation, 3 seconds feels completely natural. People pause to think all the time. But for a language-anxious speaker, 3 seconds of silence after someone speaks can feel like an eternity, like an emergency, like something that must be filled immediately at any cost, even if the cost is blurting out something confused or incomplete. 3 seconds changes everything. In 3 seconds, you can take a breath. You can identify what was actually asked or said. You can assemble the beginning of a response. You can choose the vocabulary you want to use rather than grabbing the first word your panicking brain throws forward. You can, most importantly, move from the reactive threat response mode where your prefrontal cortex is offline back toward a slightly more regulated state where language is more accessible. Practice this in low-stakes conversations first. Deliberately pause before responding. Let the silence sit. You will discover that it does not feel as catastrophic to the other person as your anxiety predicted. They are waiting. They have patience. The conversation is not going to run away while you take 3 seconds to think. The second framework is what conversation researchers call the repair cycle, and understanding it gives you an entirely different relationship with the moments when communication breaks down. Every conversation, even between native speakers, involves moments of miscommunication. A word is not heard correctly, a reference is missed, an implication is not caught. These miscommunications are not failures of the conversation. They are normal events that conversations have built-in tools to handle. The repair cycle goes like this. Communication breaks down. Someone signals that it has broken down through an expression, a word, a question, and then the parties work together to repair it by repeating, rephrasing, clarifying, adding context until the communication is reestablished. For a second language speaker, the key insight is that repair is collaborative. When someone does not understand you, they are not rejecting you. They are inviting you to try again, differently. And when you do not understand someone, signaling that is not an admission of incompetence, it is an act of conversational honesty that the other person almost always respects. Saying, "I am sorry. Could you say that again?" Or, "I want to make sure I understand, are you saying?" is not weakness. It is conversational skill. It is what effective communicators do. Having a small arsenal of repair phrases, phrases for asking for clarification, for confirming understanding, for buying time when you need to think, is not cheating. It is preparation. Could you repeat that? What do you mean by, "If I understand correctly, you are saying?" I want to make sure I am following just to confirm. These are not crutches, they are tools. Every proficient communicator uses them. The native speaker who pretends they have never said, "Sorry, what was that?" is lying. The third framework concerns the mechanics of conversation entry, how to get into a conversation that is already happening, or how to initiate one from scratch. For many language-anxious speakers, the initiation is the hardest part. Once the conversation is moving, it carries you, but starting it, making the first move, in a second language, with a stranger or in a group, can feel like stepping off a cliff. The truth about conversation initiation is that the content matters far less than the intention. People respond to the warmth and interest behind a conversation opener far more than to its linguistic sophistication. "What do you think about?" followed by a genuinely curious facial expression, is infinitely more effective than an eloquent but cold sentence. Small talk is not about the words, it is about the signal. I am interested in you. I am safe. I am open. For entering group conversations, the principle of contribution over competition is useful. You do not need to say the most interesting thing in the room. You do not need to top the previous speaker. You need to add a question, an agreement with specifics, a brief personal connection to what was just said, a genuine observation. Small, specific, real contributions are more socially effective than grand, impressive speeches, and they require far less of your limited cognitive bandwidth. The fourth framework addresses what I call the complexity confidence calibration, the ongoing adjustment between how complex you try to make your English and how confident you feel in a given moment. This is not about speaking simply all the time, it is about being strategic. When your anxiety is high, your cognitive resources are limited. In those moments, deliberately choose simpler language. A simple sentence that communicates clearly is better in every way than a complex sentence that collapses midway and leaves both you and your listener confused. Simplicity is not a failure of ambition. It is communicative intelligence. The best communicators in any language are not those who use the most complex structures. They are those who use exactly the complexity the moment requires, no more, no less. A sentence that communicates an idea precisely is a good sentence regardless of how grammatically elaborate it is. And as your anxiety in a given context decreases over time, which it will, if you keep showing up, you can gradually allow your complexity to increase. You can experiment with longer sentences, with idioms, with vocabulary you are not certain about. You are calibrating to conditions, the way a pilot adjusts to weather. Sometimes you fly low and slow. Sometimes you can push higher. The fifth framework is what I call the interest engine, a conversational strategy so simple it almost sounds too easy, but which is backed by an enormous amount of research in interpersonal communication. The strategy is this: ask genuine questions and listen to the answers. Research consistently shows that people evaluate a conversation partner as more intelligent, more likable, and more interesting when that partner asks them questions about themselves. Not because people are vain, though some are, but because genuine curiosity is one of the most attractive social signals. It says, "You are interesting to me. Your experience matters. I want to understand your perspective." For a language-anxious speaker, the interest engine is also a practical relief. When you are asking questions and listening to answers, the pressure is temporarily on the other person. You have thinking time while they speak. You can formulate your next contribution while they are talking. You are active in the conversation without being primarily responsible for its forward momentum. Ask about people's experiences. Ask about their opinions. Ask follow-up questions, the most underused tool in conversation. When someone says something interesting, a follow-up question, "Really? What happened then?" Or, "What did you think about that?" signals deep engagement and keeps the conversation moving with minimal linguistic burden on your side. Follow-up questions are the highest return on investment conversational move available to a second language speaker. The sixth framework is the error recovery sequence, a practical protocol for what to do when you make a mistake that you realize mid-sentence. The usual response is to freeze, apologize, restart, and in the process, lose the thread of what you were trying to say entirely. The error recovery sequence does something different. When you realize mid-sentence that you have made a mistake or chosen the wrong word, you have three options. First, you can simply continue if the error does not prevent comprehension. Keep going. The listener is following your meaning, not auditing your grammar. Many errors, if left in place, are not noticed. Second, if the error would genuinely confuse meaning, you can use a smooth repair phrase, or rather, that is to say, and continue with the correction without stopping or apologizing. He went to the library, or rather, she went to the library. That is a native-level repair, no apology needed. Third, if the error is significant and you cannot repair it smoothly, you can use a reset phrase. Let me rephrase that and start the sentence again. Reset, not retreat. What you do not do is stop the conversation, apologize profusely, explain that your English is not good, and undermine everything you are trying to say with a performance of self-deprecation that makes the other person uncomfortable. Errors are events in a conversation. They are not catastrophes. Handle them as events. Keep moving. The seventh and final framework in this chapter concerns what I call the after-conversation practice. What you do after a significant English conversation to maximize what you learn from it. Immediately after the conversation, while it is fresh, spend 2 minutes in what I call a memory harvest. Not a self-critique, a harvest. What language did you hear that was interesting? What phrases did you encounter that you want to add to your active vocabulary? What did you try to say that came out wrong, and how might you have said it better? Were there moments when you surprised yourself positively? What did you learn about the other person or about yourself in this language? The memory harvest treats conversation as data, not as performance to be judged. It acknowledges that every real conversation is a learning event, an opportunity to acquire language and context, to test hypotheses, to build accuracy through reflection, to grow. The conversation is not over when you say goodbye. It continues for another few minutes in the reflection that follows. Over weeks and months of consistent memory harvesting, you begin to see patterns in your errors, in your vocabulary gaps, in the kinds of expressions you reach for and cannot find. These patterns tell you exactly where to direct your deliberate study time. The harvest makes your speaking experience feed directly back into your acquisition engine. The loop closes. The system becomes self-improving. Real conversation, with all its messiness and risk and beauty, is the destination this whole book has been pointing toward. Not the perfect conversation, not the conversation where you never stumble, the real one, imperfect, alive, full of meaning, full of connection. That conversation is available to you now. It has been available to you all along. You just needed the frameworks, the science, the permission, and the reminder of something that was always true. You are a speaker. Use your voice. The final word, a letter to the person who has been waiting. I want to speak to you directly, one last time, before you close this book and step back into your life. I know who you are because I have met you in many forms. You are the person who stayed quiet in the meeting when you had something important to say. You are the person who typed out a message in English, read it back, decided it was not good enough, and deleted it. You are the person who rehearsed a sentence for 3 minutes and then lost your nerve before saying it. You are the person who went home after a social event and lay in bed replaying every English utterance you attempted, cataloging every imperfection, wondering if people thought less of you. You are also the person who has been working at this for years, who has studied, who has practiced, who has genuinely tried, who has made progress that the fear has not allowed you to fully see or credit. Who has English inside you, real English, significant English, English that is entirely capable of serving you in the world, waiting to be let out from behind the wall your own brain built. I want you to know that the wall was never a sign of weakness. It was a sign of intelligence, a protective intelligence that over-applied a very reasonable principle. The principle is, do not risk harm. The over-application was, speaking imperfect English is a form of harm. That over-application was understandable. It came from real experiences in real classrooms and real social situations where imperfect English did sometimes feel like harm, where it did sometimes lead to embarrassment or dismissal, or the painfully familiar experience of being heard as less than you are. But you are not in that classroom anymore, and the world outside it is larger, more forgiving, more genuinely curious about what you have to say than the environments that taught you to be afraid. Here is what I want to leave with you. Not a technique, not a strategy, a belief. And I want you to try it on, even if it does not yet fit perfectly, the way you might try on a coat that is slightly too large, trusting that you will grow into it. The belief is this: your voice matters. Not when it is perfect, now, as it is, with its accent and its approximations and its occasional wrong tense. The things you know, the experiences you have had, the perspective you carry, the humor in you, the intelligence in you, the heart in you, these deserve to be heard. And they can only be heard if you speak. Every language on earth has an imperfect version of itself being spoken right now by someone who is brave enough to try. The world is full of imperfect, beautiful, wildly effective communication happening in a second language. Add your voice to it. Not tomorrow, not when you have taken one more course, not when you have finally reached the level you decided at some point in the past would be good enough. Now, the English is there. The words are there. The sentences are forming. Open your mouth. Let them out. Supplemental chapter. The environment design. Engineering your life for automatic English growth. There is a concept in behavioral science called choice architecture, the idea that the environment in which you make decisions profoundly shapes the decisions you make, often more than your conscious intentions do. The psychologist Richard Thaler, who won the Nobel Prize partly for this work, showed that small changes in how options are presented and arranged lead to dramatically different behavior patterns. People do not always do what they intend to do. They do what their environment makes easy. This concept is your ally in language learning. If you design your environment well, English exposure and English practice happen automatically, without willpower, without constant deliberate effort. If you design your environment poorly, if you have to fight your surroundings to access English, the daily grind of motivation will eventually exhaust you, and the good intentions will fade. Let us talk about environmental design specifically for English acquisition and speaking development. The first layer is what I call passive immersion, arranging your environment so that English input reaches you as a byproduct of your normal life rather than as a separate, dedicated activity. Passive immersion is the background audio of an English podcast while you cook dinner. It is the English subtitles on a film you are watching for entertainment. It is the English language newsletter in your professional field that replaces the one you were reading in your first language. It is the English language radio station playing in the background while you work. None of these require a dedicated block of learning time. They all add to your total acquisition hours, quietly and constantly. The key principle of passive immersion is that exposure adds up even when it is not focused. Your brain is processing language even when you are not consciously studying it. The patterns are being logged. The vocabulary is being encountered. The rhythms and structures are accumulating in your implicit memory. An environment saturated with English, not overwhelmingly, not in a way that exhausts you, but consistently present, is an environment that does a portion of your language acquisition work for you. The second layer is friction reduction for speaking practice. One of the biggest obstacles to daily speaking practice is simply the friction involved in setting it up. You need to find a conversation partner, schedule a time, open an app, join a platform. These steps, each of them small, add up to enough friction that on a difficult day, a tired day, a busy day, a day when your motivation is lower than usual, you skip the practice entirely. Multiply that by enough difficult days, and the habit falls apart. Friction reduction means pre-solving these setup problems. It means having your language exchange partner's number in your phone with a standing weekly call already in the calendar. It means having a voice recorder app already on your home screen, ready to press in one tap when you want to do a speaking journal. It means having your shadowing material already queued up so that when you have 15 minutes, you press play and start immediately rather than spending 12 of those minutes finding something to use. The setup should require 0 decisions. The practice should begin immediately. The third layer is what I call social engineering, deliberately arranging your social environment so that it includes more English interaction than your default would produce. This is more challenging because it involves other people who have their own lives and priorities. But it is also more powerful because social interaction is the most potent form of language acquisition and the most effective context for developing the speaking fluency that is our ultimate goal. What does social engineering look like practically? It might mean joining an English language book club, even an online one. It might mean choosing an English language fitness class over one in your first language, if both are available. It might mean attending professional networking events where English is the common language, even though they are more effortful than events in your first language. It might mean reaching out to colleagues in your field who are in different countries, establishing relationships that naturally unfold in English. It might mean choosing to volunteer with or contribute to a community where English is the working language. Each of these is a designed environment that produces English practice as a byproduct of an activity you would have reason to do anyway. The English is not the point of the activity. The English is the medium through which the activity happens, and that medium, encountered regularly in meaningful contexts, is exactly the condition under which acquisition accelerates. The fourth layer is digital environment design, the configuration of your phone, computer, and online presence to maximize English contact. Change the language settings of your devices to English. This one change alone produces dozens of additional English encounters every day, every notification, every menu, every button, every error message. Your brain registers and processes all of these, and while a single instance is trivial, thousands of instances over months and years add up to meaningful exposure. Curate your social media feed to include English language accounts in areas you are genuinely interested in. Follow writers who interest you, scientists whose work fascinates you, comedians who make you laugh, communities organized around your hobbies. The content in your daily social media scroll over the course of a year constitutes an enormous amount of language input. Make it work for you. Configure your news consumption in English. The news has a particular advantage for language learners. It follows predictable narrative structures, uses recurring vocabulary around specific topics, and is produced at a level of language that is generally accessible. Following news in English means encountering and re-encountering the same vocabulary, political, economic, social, international in different contexts and constructions, which drives the kind of multiple encounters that move words from passive to active vocabulary. The fifth layer is what I call micro-practice, scheduling the integration of very short, very specific English practice moments throughout your day, scheduled in advance and tied to existing habits. The behavioral science concept here is habit stacking, attaching a new behavior to an existing one so that the existing behavior acts as an automatic trigger. You already brush your teeth every morning. Before you put the toothbrush down, you speak 3 sentences aloud in English about anything, about what you are going to do today, about what you dreamed last night, about the weather. 3 sentences, 30 seconds, done. You already eat lunch, probably. While eating, you spend 10 minutes listening to an English podcast rather than scrolling through social media in your first language. You already exercise, or you are trying to. You do it with English audio. You already have a commute, or a walk, or a moment between tasks. You use a part of it to speak to yourself in English. None of these micro-practices alone is going to make you fluent. But together, consistent, compounding daily, they represent hours and hours of additional acquisition time over the course of a year. They happen because they are built into the architecture of a day that was already happening, rather than requiring you to build a new, separate structure. They happen even on bad days, even on tired days, because the habit trigger fires automatically. The sixth layer is accountability structure, the social and external commitments that make following through on your language practice more likely than not. Human beings are deeply social in their motivational systems. We are far more likely to do difficult things when we have committed to doing them in front of someone else than when we have committed only to ourselves. An accountability partner, someone who knows you are working on your English, who checks in on your progress, who shares in your successes, is not a luxury. It is a force multiplier. It turns individual intention into social commitment, and social commitment is one of the most powerful motivational forces available. If you do not have a person in your life who can fill this role, consider online communities of language learners. There are many, and the best of them offer the same social accountability in a virtual form. Public commitment also works. Telling people you are working on your English, sharing your progress on social media, making the goal visible and social rather than private and individual. The seventh layer is what I call the English First Protocol for information seeking. Whenever you want to look something up, learn something, watch an explanation, read an article, your default question should be, is there a version of this available in English? In most domains, the answer is yes, and choosing the English version of information you are already seeking means that the cognitive effort of understanding the content serves double duty. You learn the thing you wanted to learn, and you acquire English in the process. This protocol is particularly powerful for professional and intellectual learning because you are likely to be highly motivated to understand the content, which means your comprehension is engaged at its highest level. When you are deeply interested in understanding something, you work harder to parse the language, which means you acquire more from the same amount of exposure. The combination of genuine intellectual curiosity and language learning is one of the most efficient acquisition conditions that exists. Environmental design is the infrastructure that makes consistency possible. Without it, language learning depends on willpower, a resource that depletes, that varies with mood and energy, that fails exactly when you most need it. With it, language learning happens in the background of a life that is functioning normally, accumulating quietly, building toward fluency not through heroic effort, but through smart arrangement. You do not need to redesign your entire life. Start with one layer. Change one thing in your environment this week: the podcast habit, the device language setting, the standing weekly conversation call. One thing. Watch what it produces. Add another thing the following week. Over 3 months, you will have built an environment that works for you rather than against you, an environment that is, in a real sense, an English acquisition machine. You have been doing this the hard way. You have been relying on willpower and scheduled study blocks and the exhausting burden of remembering to practice. The alternative is not easier in any lazy sense of the word. It requires real thought and real design work. But once the design is done, it runs itself. The environment does the work. And you, moving through the well-designed life you have built, become more fluent without even trying, which is exactly the condition under which the deepest, most lasting kind of fluency is built. Build the environment. Live in it. Let it teach you. The science behind the journey. Key research that shaped this book. Throughout this book, I have referenced scientific concepts and research findings that underpin the strategies and frameworks offered. For those who want to go deeper, and going deeper is always encouraged, here is a concise summary of the key areas of research that have most shaped the thinking in these chapters. The foundation rests on Stephen Krashen's input hypothesis and monitor model, developed in the 1970s and 80s, which remains one of the most influential and most debated frameworks in second language acquisition. Krashen's distinction between acquisition and learning, his concept of comprehensible input, his affective filter hypothesis, and his monitor hypothesis together form the theoretical backbone of several chapters in this book. His work has been challenged, refined, and extended, but its central intuitions have held up remarkably well against subsequent research. Merrill Swain's output hypothesis, developed in the 1980s as a complement and partial critique of Krashen's input-only view, introduced the idea that producing language speaking and writing plays a role in acquisition that input alone cannot fulfill. Her research with French immersion learners in Canada revealed that students who were surrounded by comprehensible input but had little opportunity to produce language failed to develop native-like grammatical competence. This finding directly shaped the chapters on output and the output engine. Michael Schmidt's noticing hypothesis proposes that conscious attention noticing is a necessary condition for acquiring specific language features. You cannot acquire what you have not noticed. This hypothesis, developed in the 1990s, informs the chapter on input and the discussion of how to make input more acquisitionally powerful through deliberate attention. The neuroscience of language fear draws on work from multiple fields. Joseph Ledoux's research on the amygdala and fear processing, published across several decades, provides the neurological basis for the discussion in the threat brain chapter. His work on fear memory and conditioning is fundamental to understanding why language anxiety persists and how it can be systematically addressed. Matthew Lieberman's research on social pain, the finding that social rejection activates overlapping neural circuits with physical pain, helps explain why the fear of language judgment is not trivial or irrational, but is processed by the brain as genuinely threatening. Carol Dweck's research on fixed versus growth mindsets developed over several decades at Stanford University, informs the chapters on perfectionism and the identity lock. Dweck's finding that people who believe abilities are fixed respond to failure with avoidance, while people who believe abilities are developable respond with effort maps directly onto the language learning context. The identity work in Chapter 4 draws heavily on the mindset literature. The psychology of the inner critic is informed by work in acceptance and commitment therapy, particularly Stephen Hayes' diffusion techniques, and by research on self-compassion by Kristen Neff, whose extensive work at the University of Texas has documented the paradoxical finding that self-compassion, as opposed to self-criticism, is associated with higher performance, greater resilience, and better recovery from failure. The counterintuitive implications of this research for language learners are explored in Chapter 3. James Paul G's work on language and identity, his concept of discourse with a capital D, and the idea that language is fundamentally an identity performance provides the theoretical framework for Chapter 4. His work suggests that second language acquisition is not just linguistic, but deeply social and identity-related, and that the resistance many learners feel to performing in a second language is a form of identity protection, not simply a skills deficit. The behavioral science of habit formation, particularly Charles Duhigg's synthesis of habit loop research and B.J. Fogg's behavioral design work, underpins the environmental design chapter. Fogg's concept of behavior design making desired behaviors easier and undesired behaviors harder through environmental manipulation is the practical foundation of the choice architecture discussion. Research on flow states, particularly Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi's decades of work on the psychology of optimal experience, informs the discussion of optimal language learning conditions. Csikszentmihalyi found that flow, the state of effortless, focused engagement, occurs when challenge and skill are in balance. The concept of comprehensible input at the I+1 level mirrors Csikszentmihalyi's flow channel in an interesting and probably not coincidental way. Finally, the work on second language identity by researchers, including Bonnie Norton, whose concept of investment in language learning introduced the idea that learners invest in a language when they see it as enhancing their identity and providing access to symbolic and material resources they value, has profoundly shaped the thinking on identity throughout this book. Norton's research, conducted primarily with immigrant women learning English in Canada, revealed the complex ways in which power, identity, and language intersect, and the importance of understanding language learning not as a purely cognitive process, but as a social and identity-laden one. These are the shoulders this book stands on. The researchers named here, and the many more whose work has contributed to this field without being named, have spent careers building an understanding of how language learning actually works. Their work deserves your attention, and if any thread in this book has caught your curiosity, follow it back to its source. The literature is rich, and the conversations happening within it are among the most fascinating in human science. You are not just learning a language, you are participating in one of the most remarkable things a human brain can do, reaching across the boundary of a different language system, a different cognitive architecture, a different way of carving the world into meaning, and finding that on the other side of that boundary, other human minds are reaching back. That reaching is the whole point. Keep reaching. Speaking as a practice of courage. Before you go, I want to offer something that is less instruction and more invitation. This book has been about English, about brains and science and strategies and frameworks. But if you zoom out far enough, it has been about something larger, about the particular kind of courage that is required to be imperfect in front of other people, about the choice made daily to keep going towards something difficult rather than settling into the comfortable silence of not trying. That choice is available to every human being in every domain of life. The language learner who speaks despite the fear is practicing the same fundamental courage as the person who has the difficult conversation they have been avoiding for months. As the person who submits the creative work, they are afraid to be judged on, as the person who shows up honestly in a relationship rather than hiding behind pleasantness. Courage is not the absence of fear. Every teacher, every coach, every veteran of difficult endeavors will tell you the same thing. Courage is the capacity to act in the presence of fear, to keep moving towards something meaningful while the fear is still running in the background. The fear does not go away first, the action comes first. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes the action diminishes the fear, and sometimes it does not, but the action produces something valuable anyway, the thing that was communicated, the connection that was made, the sentence that was spoken. You are not waiting to be fearless. Fearlessness is not the destination is the conversation. The destination is the expression of your actual self, in a language that can carry you to people and places and opportunities that would otherwise be inaccessible. I want to end with a simple practice, not a technique for fluency, a practice for being. Tonight or tomorrow morning, find a quiet moment. Sit somewhere comfortable and speak, aloud, in English, for 2 minutes. Not about English, not about language learning. About something you actually care about, something you are excited about, or worried about, or grateful for, or curious about. Something real. Do not monitor. Do not correct yourself. Do not evaluate. Just speak. Let the English be what it is. Let the sentences come out in whatever form they come. Let the pauses happen, and let the words find their way around them. Let yourself be heard, even if only by yourself. This is the practice, not the perfect execution of a language. The practice of speaking your own life, in whatever English you currently have, with the trust that the English will grow to meet the life you are living in it. 2 minutes, tonight. That is all. The rest will follow. This has been You Are Not Bad at English Your Brain is Blocking You. Thank you for listening. Deep dive. The accent question: why your accent is not the problem. Few topics trigger more anxiety in English learners than accent. The word itself carries enormous psychological weight. An accent feels like a mark, a visible sign that you are from somewhere else, that you are not entirely at home in the language, that your English is foreign in some way that cannot be hidden the way a grammar error can be hidden. Grammar errors are momentary. An accent is always present. It is in every word you speak. And for many learners, particularly those who have been teased or criticized or simply made to feel self-conscious about the way they sound in English, the accent becomes the central explanation for their speaking difficulty. I would be fine, the thinking goes, if only I did not have this accent. I want to address this directly and completely because the belief that accent is the problem is one of the most paralyzing beliefs a language learner can hold, and it is almost entirely wrong. First, let us be clear about what an accent is. An accent is the result of your speech production system, your lungs, your larynx, your tongue, your lips, your palate, having been trained from infancy on the specific sounds of your first language. Every language has its own phonological inventory, its own set of sounds, its own patterns of stress and rhythm, its own rules for how sounds transition from one to the next. When you learn English, your speech production system has to learn to produce sounds it was not trained for and to organize them in patterns that differ from the patterns it knows. This is genuinely hard, and it takes time, and for most adult learners, the influence of the first language on English pronunciation is never fully eliminated. The accent persists. This is completely normal. This is expected. This is not a failure of your English. It is the natural result of learning a language as an adult. Now, here is the crucial question. Does accent interfere with communication? The answer, in most cases, is no. The research on accent and intelligibility, the study of how well non-native accented speech is understood by listeners, consistently shows that accent alone, in the absence of other factors, rarely prevents comprehension. What matters for intelligibility is not whether you have an accent, but whether your pronunciation is consistent and whether you use correct word stress. English is a stress-timed language. which means that the rhythm of English is largely driven by which syllables in which words receive emphasis. Errors in word stress, placing the stress on the wrong syllable, are far more disruptive to comprehension than a non-native accent. A listener can usually adjust to an accent within a few sentences. Systematic word stress errors are harder to adjust to. This means that if you want to work on your pronunciation, and it is worth working on, not for the sake of sounding native, but for the sake of clarity, word stress is the highest leverage area. Learn the stress patterns of English words you use frequently. Practice them. The payoff in terms of intelligibility is far greater than trying to eliminate every trace of your native accent. But here is the deeper point, and it is one I want to make strongly. The goal of sounding like a native speaker is the wrong goal. It is a goal that, for most adult learners, is impossible to fully achieve, and that sets up a standard against which you will always fall short. More importantly, it is a goal that is based on a false premise. The premise that the native speaker accent is the correct, legitimate, desirable version of English, and that all other accents are deviations to be corrected. This is linguistically wrong and culturally harmful. There is no single correct English accent. There are many Englishes, each with their own phonological patterns, and none of them has more inherent legitimacy than any other. The Nigerian accent is not a deviation from British English. It is a variety of English with its own internal consistency. The Indian accent is not imperfect American English. It is English shaped by the phonological resources of South Asian languages, and it has its own beauty and precision. The Pakistani accent, the Filipino accent, the Brazilian accent, the Korean accent, each of these is a genuine way of speaking English, not a failure to achieve someone else's way. The accent anxiety that so many learners carry is, at its root, a form of internalized linguistic prejudice, the belief that some ways of speaking English are better than others, and that the ways associated with non-native speakers are worse. That belief is worth examining, worth challenging, and worth letting go of. Not because your pronunciation does not matter, it does, for intelligibility reasons, but because the shame and self-consciousness associated with a non-native accent are based on an evaluation framework that is simply wrong. Here is a practical experiment. Over the next week, pay attention to how you respond when you hear non-native accented English from other people. Notice whether your reaction is one of judgment, their English is bad, or one of respect, they are communicating in a language that is not their first. Most people, when they are paying attention, discover that they are more generous toward other accented speakers than they are toward themselves. The standard you hold yourself to is stricter than the standard you apply to others. That asymmetry is not justice, it is self-attack, and recognizing it for what it is the first step toward releasing it. Your accent is yours. It carries information about where you are from, what languages you know, the path you have traveled to get to English. It is not a flaw, it is a signature. Speak with it, be heard with it. It is part of your English, and your English is part of you. Deep dive, the grammar trap, what grammar can and cannot do for your fluency. Let us talk about grammar. Specifically, let us talk about the relationship between grammar knowledge and speaking fluency, because this relationship is widely misunderstood in ways that lead directly to the trap described in Chapter 1, the trap of knowing English without being able to speak it. Grammar knowledge, explicit, conscious knowledge of the rules of English, is genuinely useful in some contexts. It is useful in writing, where you have time to review and correct. It is useful in careful, monitored speech, where you have time to think. It is useful for understanding the feedback you receive when someone corrects a specific error. It is useful as a framework for noticing language patterns in the input you encounter. In all of these contexts, grammar knowledge serves a genuine function. But grammar knowledge has a strict ceiling beyond which it cannot take you. Above that ceiling, in the domain of fluent, natural, spontaneous speech, grammar knowledge is not just unhelpful. It is an active obstacle. Every moment you spend consciously accessing and applying a grammar rule in real speech is a moment of cognitive delay that disrupts the flow of communication. The prefrontal cortex, running its grammar checks, competes with the fluency-oriented automatic system for cognitive resources, and the result is the halting, over-monitored speech that feels so frustratingly different from the natural speech you produce in your head. This is why the most grammar-knowledgeable English students in the world are often not the most fluent speakers. Grammar study, done in isolation and in excess, creates a strong, explicit knowledge base without a corresponding automatic system. The grammar is present as information rather than as skill, and information in your head does not translate to fluency in your mouth. What does translate to fluency is what linguists call proceduralized knowledge grammar that has moved from explicit and deliberate into implicit and automatic. This proceduralization happens through speaking the grammar in communicative contexts repeatedly until it becomes effortless. The key research finding here is that proceduralization requires meaningful use, not drill. Repeating the same sentence 100 times does not make the grammar automatic in the way that using similar grammar in 100 different meaningful communicative acts does. The brain needs variation, context, and meaning to build the automatic system. This means that for a learner who has strong explicit grammar knowledge and weak speaking fluency, which describes a very large proportion of formally educated English learners, the prescription is not more grammar study. It is more speaking, with the grammar being expressed communicatively rather than monitored consciously. The goal is not to forget the grammar rules. It is to practice the relevant patterns until the grammar runs in the background rather than in the foreground. One practical technique for accelerating this proceduralization is what some teachers call grammar-focused oral tasks, structured speaking activities that involve using a specific grammar pattern communicatively and repeatedly. The key word is communicatively. The task has a real communicative purpose, and the grammar pattern emerges from that purpose rather than being drilled in isolation. For example, a task that requires you to compare past and present states of a situation, how things were versus how they are now, naturally generates past and present tense structures in a communicative context, and the repeated use of those structures in service of real meaning is far more effective at building proceduralized knowledge than repeating paradigms from a textbook. Another practical technique is the deliberate use of Grammar Clinic's brief, focused sessions after a speaking practice, in which you identify one or two specific errors that arose from the session and practice the correct form in a targeted way. The error has been made real by the speaking activity. The correction is immediately relevant and meaningful, and the targeted practice that follows is brief and specific rather than broad and abstract. This sequence speak, notice error, practice target pattern, speak again is one of the most efficient feedback loops available for building both fluency and accuracy simultaneously without the two goals undermining each other. The most important thing to understand about grammar in relation to fluency is this: the goal is not to eliminate errors. The goal is to communicate effectively while errors gradually diminish through natural acquisition. An error today that goes into your speaking experience and into your input stream and into your awareness is an error that has a good chance of not being made next month. An error you avoid making by refusing to speak is an error that has no pathway to resolution. It stays unknown, untested, unchallenged. The only errors that cost you are the ones you make publicly without any further reflection. The errors made in service of communication and followed by honest observation are not losses, they are investments. Let your grammar be a tool you use, not a standard you are judged by. The tool is yours. Use it freely, imperfectly, and progressively. That is how it becomes fluent. A note on the journey ahead. You have now heard every chapter, every framework, every piece of science, and every practical strategy this book has to offer. You have spent time inside the brain science of language block, inside the psychology of the inner critic, inside the neurobiology of the threat response, inside the sociology of language identity, inside the behavioral mechanics of habit change. You have been given more maps than most language learners ever receive. Maps are useful, but maps are not the territory. The territory is the actual conversation, the actual speaking, the actual moment-to-moment reality of using a language to navigate the world. No amount of reading or listening about speaking replaces speaking. No amount of understanding about fluency replaces building it. At some point, and that point is now, the book has to end and the practice has to begin. Here is what I suggest for your first week after finishing this audiobook. Choose one thing, just one. One change to your speaking environment, one new habit, one commitment to a conversation you have been avoiding. Not 10 things, not a comprehensive system. One thing, done consistently for 7 days, is worth more than 10 things planned and never started. If you are not sure which one thing to choose, here is my recommendation: solo speaking. Start talking to yourself in English. Today, about anything. About nothing, for 2 minutes. It costs nothing, it risks nothing, and it begins the physical, neurological, habitual work of becoming someone who speaks English as a natural part of their daily life. From that one seed, everything else in this book can grow. The English is there, the voice is there, the person you are becoming confident, expressive, fully yourself in English is there, waiting in the sentences you have not yet spoken. Speak the first one. Everything changes from there.